is the ways that organizations have evolved over the past decade in particular. You've gone through all these delayering initiatives that have kind of taken layers out of the hierarchy to streamline decision-making cycles, assuming that was the thing that was slowing everything down. At the same time that we've layered on all these collaborative tools. It's, the Slack channels, it's IM, it's the team spaces, it's the email, right? The Zoom calls, maybe a gratitude application, one or two other custom things that people are doing in their organizations, because all these technologies look cheap, right, from the CIO office, but you layer them on and it creates just a phenomenal overwhelm. Pre-pandemic, people were spending about 85% of their time on the phone, on email, in meetings. And that number has progressively gone up over the past decade, about 50% or more. And it went up through the pandemic again. People are working about 5 to 8 hours more a week. They're working earlier into the morning, deeper into the night. Most people will immediately say the first thing they do in the morning when they roll out of bed is, as you expect, right? I'm going to check the phone, right? I'm going to check the connectivity that I, have showing up on my nightstand. And many, many people, unfortunately, are checking it through the night. But it starts kind of, very first thing in the morning, and it rolls forward through meeting schedules and email and other kinds of connectivity. We've done now over 800 interviews with these people. And we started with the really efficient collaborators to see what they were doing, and then worked our way into kind of things that create performance, things that drive well-being. And you get into these conversations that the first 10 minutes, it's like the ones we always have, right? Everything's great. It's a great persona. But then you start digging down and you really hear how people are struggling to kind of manage today, right? And it's become super personal. The pattern you see is, just these increasing efforts to manage across all these platforms, to manage more meetings. So one of the crazy things in COVID, for example, is many of us have this great idea of we're just going to try to jam more meetings in the same day, right? And so you move from where you had 8 one-hour meetings pre-COVID to now we've got 16 30-minute meetings, and it's exhausting, right? You're more intense in those meetings because you got to be fully present. You're switching across things more rapidly and trying to catch up on a text or two with a split second. That's exhausting. And then you end the day with a to-do list, not based on 8 meetings, but 16. I had really been convinced that collaborative overload, the excessive demands that were hurting performance, it was completely external, right? It was emails, time zones, nasty bosses, demanding clients. It was all kind of outside there. And I came out the other end of what's accumulated now to about 600 interviews, completely convinced that 50% or more of the problem is us. And we all have these triggers that lead us to jump in when we shouldn't. And, for me, it's a desire for accomplishment, right? If I see 5 minutes of room, I'm going to jam 60 minutes of stuff and ignore the 3 hours of, communication I have to do to get other people on board. And I'll wonder, 2, 3, 8 weeks out, why am I overloaded when it was me that started it to begin with? I'm grumbling about the situation, but it was me that started it. And we find that happens so much for people with all these subtle triggers that we just don't realize sometimes kind of how we're creating our own problems because of the distance between what you do and how you experience it. One cost is just lost engagement, right? So we basically see that the people that do this well, they get back 18 to 24% of their time. You start adding that up and where we're getting hit, number one is around innovation, right? And we've seen this again go through the pandemic is people's connectivity patterns have focused more internally, and they've been losing those bridging ties to other pockets. And the second, and third big cost for me are around attrition and losing, in particular, the overwhelmed people. And especially as we go into 2022 and the resignations that are planned, the big surprise that people are going to have is it's the people that were overwhelmed to begin with that learned through COVID there's a different way to live their lives. And so they're not going to resubscribe to it, right? And so that's going to be a very substantive cost that companies don't measure well, right? They'll measure that as the cost of acquiring the talent, but they'll forget that those people, if they make 10 other people's lives 5% harder for 6 months, until you find another replacement, there's a real cost to that economically. That's much bigger than oftentimes the human capital piece of it. And then the third is just around the mental health costs, right? I mean, they're skyrocketing in places, and not everything, but a lot of it you can actually tie back to this context where people are just drowning right? And trying to figure out how to get through all these demands as they go. I would first of all see it. There's no, one single seductive principle. Every single time I'm asked, what's the one thing? If you just had one idea, right, for people and what they needed to do. And this is not that game. This is more of a brawl than a ballet, right? And I find that these people are clawing back time by being, really persistent. One is how they put structure into their work on the margin. So you're much more likely to see, for example, the more efficient collaborators strategically calendar Friday night or Sunday night with a 1 week horizon and usually about a 3-month time frame in mind. And so they're putting structure into their calendar that is putting energizing interactions after de-energizing ones, or starting to set up conversations with others that lead into capabilities they want to be using in their work. How they manage these identity triggers, our tendencies to jump in when we shouldn't, which is much bigger than we realize. And then just behaviorally and tactically, how they set norms around collaboration, not just for themselves, but they bring it into their teams so that these practices kind of hold in different ways. The real key to me is not just getting that time back, but it's how they spend it that enables them to innovate in very different ways and to create things at a greater scale. And the key thing that we've learned from these people is that they tend to collaborate in ways that drive more innovation through their network. We've known for a long time, since the 1970s, it's not a big network. Typically, it's predicting a high performer. It's one with more bridging connections into different pockets of an organization. But then the question is, well, what do you tell busy people, right, to do with this? What we learned in that is that the more successful people, they tend to spend about 20 to 25% more time exploring possibilities with others and saying, how could we work together from different functions, different capabilities, different geographies? They're just a little bit more, conscious of the value of doing that. What I thought was really cool is it's not somebody tapping some invisible power structure in places, but they're seeding relationships, developing an understanding of how they could work together with others. And then when the opportunity comes by, their response is much greater than people that don't do this. Right. So they're able to kind of mobilize resources, they produce a bigger outcome versus the person that's just stayed hunkered down, or they're just turning to the same 5 people they did the last 10 times. We've gone behind these network diagrams now, myself or people on my team, for 20 plus years. And we would interview the energizers, right? The people that are creating the enthusiasm and the energized, right? And to see kind of what do you think's going on in these connections. And you hear things like they see realistic possibilities that connect with what others care about, right? So it's not that they're positioning ideas in a way that's just good for them, or it's so extreme that it doesn't connect with what others care about. They are really good at figuring out how to frame things in a way that other people get engaged too, right? And pulled into the effort. So we find, for example, the most energizing leaders, they tend to be the ones that have systematic one-on-ones with their followers, where about 50% or more of the time is off task. They're exploring those people's interests or aspirations. And what that does is that they, on the margin, they're able to shape the nature of the work that comes to those people, not entirely, but on the margin, they can line it up in ways that just gets better engagement, better enthusiasm from them. And they win, not because they're cheerleaders, you're just as likely to hear them disagree as agree, but they win because suddenly they have better talent wanting to work for them, right? Because the growth opportunities are there. That talent stays longer with them, and they're getting scale right out of their network, right? That's the real key to why the energizers win. It's not just that they're happy people, but it's the way that they create pull in the network that enables them to scale what they're doing. From a well-being standpoint, one of the things that I really consistently found are stories of people that would enter into these, highly demanding jobs and fall into what I call an echo chamber, right? And I heard this so many different times where people would describe points in their lives or their careers where work had become all-consuming and they'd fallen out of these groups that had been a piece of their identity and really deeply into that system of work, thinking things are going great, feeling energy, pursuing revenue goals, whatever it may be, and then having some wake-up moment. Sometimes it was 3, 5, 8 years in, where they kind of woke up and said, wow, I've been living in a way that isn't who I meant to be to begin with, right? And sometimes that happened when people had a flight canceled and they pulled into their driveway and they looked around and realized that their kids are gone, their wife's out doing something else, and they've lost all their hobbies. Another woman was describing scenarios where she'd given 8 years of her life in this really high intense job in Silicon Valley, thought she had really great friends, and her mother passed away and nobody showed up at the funeral. And what I would see people do to get out of that were one of two things. One is they would reach back to relationships that were strong from the past and use some kind of activity to pull them back together. Right. So that maybe travel, it could be a game night, it could be all sorts of things. But the idea is kind of tapping back into these dormant connections. The other is to pick a passion from the past and use that to slingshot into a new group. And I would hear this in terms of sports that people did in high school. Or one of my favorite interviews was the head of neuroscience at one of the leading hospitals in the world. So here's this very, pedigreed person, mid 60s probably, and just giddy, telling me how he started playing guitar again and he's hanging out with 20-year-olds. And it's just creating a new version, right, of who he is and how he's experiencing things.